Fish 10. Ego, the sense of self. Ego, defined. The Latin first-person singular pronoun, ego, I, in English has been incorporated into the English language, yet, with a rather unorthodox import. Within spiritual circles, as well as in common discourse, the term is grossly misused, in order to designate an exaggerated sense of self-importance, arrogance, conceit, vanity, pride, or stubbornness, etc. However, from the point of view of spiritual teachings, especially in the Anglosphere, it is a poor translation of the Sanskrit, ahamkara, a term that originated most probably in the Samkhya philosophy of India. Therefore, it may have been more fitting for this chapter to be entitled, ahamkara, since the word, ego, is not the most apposite translation of, ahamkara. It may be prudent to compare the analysis of egoity in this chapter, with the Freudian concept of, das Ich, the I, in English. As a point of clarification, this chapter deals with the human being's perceived sense of self, which revolves around the question of, who am I? In addition to the essential nature of the self, which revolves around the question of, what am I? The former notion centers around the concept of, ahamkara, or, I-making, whilst the latter notion is more of a metaphysical matter. How's that for an apparent oxymoron? Ahamkara, disambiguated. The ancient Sanskritam term, aham, simply means, I, and, ahamkara, means, creating the I, self, or, activating the sense of self, or else, constructing one's identity, karam, coming from the same verbal root as the well-known word, karma, and denotes an action or a deed. The English calque, that is, lone translation, of the Sanskrit term, ahamkara, might be either, I-doer, or, I-maker, or possibly, ego-making. As an aside, some Sanskrit scholars have noticed that the word, aham, is formed of a plus ha plus m, a triad of Shiva, a, Sakti, ha, and Bindu, m. The entire Sanskrit alphabet is enclosed by those two syllables, just as the Greek tongue begins and ends with, alpha, and, omega, respectively. I am the Alpha and the Omega, said God in the book of Revelations. Incidentally, the palindrome of aham is maha, meaning great. Common misinterpretations. It was the psychologist, Sigmund Freud, in fact, his original translator, who put ego into the popular vocabulary, but what he meant by the word is complex, so only other psychologists really use it in the Freudian sense. Complicating the matter, the term, ahamkara, is interpreted somewhat differently in various schools of Bharatiya Indian philosophy, and this may explain the reason why most contemporary spiritual seekers use the term, ego, to denote pride, arrogance, as well as slightly divergent interpretations, depending on the particular teaching in question. For example, one of the most popular contemporary spiritual teachers, Ulrich Leonard, Eckhart Tolle, defines the word as follows: the ego is a sense of self that arises when the mind is completely unobserved. The unobserved mind brings about the ego. In fact, the unobserved mind is the ego. These are mental structures, which are energy formations, because every thought is an energy formation. Energy formations in your head, that say, that's me. That's me and my life, and there are certain characteristics to this egoic state. One characteristic is that it exists in a state of frequent dissatisfaction, discontent, and there is an undercurrent of, something vital is missing in my life. To Tolle's legion of gullible followers, this explanation probably sounds like an intelligent and highly cogent understanding of the notion of egoity, but to one who is actually enlightened and knowledgeable, it is little more than a bunch of confused and incoherent ramblings of a deluded madman. As mentioned multiple times in this holy book, virtually every spiritual master in history is really just an ignorant fool. Thus, whilst every so-called spiritual teacher, particularly in modern times, may have his or her own understanding of what constitutes ego and or ahamkara, there is but a singular etymological definition of these terms, which this chapter attempts to clarify, for the benefit of all. And, for the interest of those sophistic philosophers who may accuse this author of constructing an informal logical fallacy, it is suggested they very carefully study the glossary entry, etymology, in order to understand the importance of proper etymology to this subject matter. The origin of egoity. It is most probable that the sense of self developed in the Homo sapiens species, concurrently with the emergence of natural spoken language, because before verbal language had been established in our species, it would have been impossible for a human to refer to himself or herself as a discrete individual, except perhaps through sign language or possibly through private language. Thus, no other species of animal, as far as it can be ascertained, has both the brain configuration and the verbal acuity to be able to refer to itself as I, though certain highly advanced species, such as apes and cetaceans, seem to approximate this phenomenon, especially after being trained in sign language by a human agent. When a non-human animal, assuming that highly intelligent extraterrestrial species do not currently exist, of course, as well as a human being who has yet to reach the ego stage of development, at approximately 3 years of age, is communicating with others of its species, it may express a myriad of thoughts and feelings, such as pain, pleasure, hunger, anger, and sadness, but it cannot conceive of itself as an individual, e.g. I am hungry, even though it may be feeling hungry, so it will not say to itself, I am hungry and therefore, I will go out and seek food. The I maker is one of the 8 material elements, as explicated in Chapter 05, and it is best to use the Sanskritam equivalent, because there exists no singular English translation of ahamkara. Unfortunately, the totally bogus mistranslation, false ego, has become popular in some circles, due to its use by a widely spread Vaishnava, Hindu, pseudo-religious organization, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The human ego equals the human person. The most accurate definition of ego, I, is the self, which is a conscious human person. A human person is the stainless consciousness of source, i.e. spirit, in theistic terminology, or the very ground of all being, in non-theistic verbiage, acting through a particular body-mind complex, which in turn is an ever-morphing biological organism. As explained elsewhere in this holy scripture, the body-mind complex is more accurately described as a process, a verb rather than a fixed object, a noun, which is the reason why the mystics of ancient India, properly called Bharata, preferred to categorize all transient phenomena as unreal, non-existent, asat, in Sanskrit rather than real, existent, sat, in Sanskrit. So, how do you feel now that it has been demonstrated that you are non-existent? Or, to be rather more accurate, how do you feel once it has been demonstrated in this very chapter that what you have always considered to be a static, perpetual, singular, individual persona is in fact nothing more than a nebulous process of mind and matter, without any enduring substance whatever? See also person in the glossary. In this book, the word real is rarely used in this Vedantic mode, so please refer to the glossary entry, real, reality. The fact that you are reading this text suggests that you have heard countless so-called gurus, as well as their deluded followers, proclaiming that you are not your body, or that you are neither your body nor your mind. The first thing that comes to my own mind, whenever I hear this objectively false statement, is this: do you say the same thing when referring to any other species of life? For instance, would you make the same claim about such creatures as cats or cockroaches? If not, then why do you claim that of we humans? It is truly absurd for one to assert that a man is not a man. However, it is truthfully accurate to declare that a man's essential nature is spirit, God, Brahman, ultimate reality. That which proclaims, I am not my body, is just as much a component of the human being as any other part of the body-mind construct. The entire reason for us exclaiming, this is my body, or, my mind is confused, is because one part of us, the intellect, is acting as the subject, in respect to an object, the gross material body, or, in the latter case, the I maker asserting that the intellect is behaving in a confusing manner. So, in order to make it as succinct as possible, it may be true that one's essential nature is Brahman, but this should not be the manner with which we dialogue in ordinary, everyday conversation, but reserved for those rare occasions in which the nature of reality is being discussed. When we behold any non-human living organism, whether it be a microbe, a plant, a fungus, a fish, an amphibian, a bird, or a mammal, we never say to ourselves, this plant, animal is not its body. We invariably assert, For example, this mango tree is a large plant belonging to the Mangifera indica species, with elongated leaves and an extensive root system below the ground. This insect is a bee with 6 legs and 2 sets of wings. This is a cat. That animal is a walrus. My pet dog is pregnant, etc. So, when so-called ultra-spiritual folk, who are, in fact, really just neophyte religionists, make the silly claim that they are not their body-mind organism, not only is it rather disingenuous, it is downright absurd and laughable. Of course, a human being is a human being. Obviously, we are mammals, and we have both a gross physical form and a subtle material form, i.e., consciousness. There is no such object as a spirit, or a soul, to be found in our being, for those terms actually refer to the subject. So, logically, one who asserts that he is not his body-mind, ought to make the very same claim of any other living creature, such as a mosquito. Read the glossary entries, subject, object, and spirit, to understand the precise meaning of these terms. A dialectical exercise for discovering the essential self. The quasi-dialogue in the following 3 paragraphs should help one to understand the nature of the fundamental conscious observer, that is, the ultimate observer of all phenomena, or, in other words, the subject, which is the authentic self, as opposed to any material object. If someone were to ask you if you are the same individual now that you were at birth, or even at conception, you would probably respond in the affirmative. So, then, what precisely is it about you that has remained constant since conception? In other words, what is the self-identity you had as an infant that is the present you? It cannot be any part of your body or mind, since none of the atoms or molecules in your zygote body are extant, and you certainly did not possess a mind at conception. If you are reasonably intelligent, you may claim that your genotype is the same now as it was then. However, it has recently been scientifically demonstrated that genetic sequencing can mutate throughout an individual's lifetime, or at least, that the expression of individual genes are switched on according to various environmental factors, such as stress, diet, and exposure to pollutants. Furthermore, nobody factually conceives of their essential nature as being merely a sequence of genes. More intelligent souls would probably counter thus: that which persists from my conception to the present moment is my sense of self. This, too, is mistaken, since the sense of self does not emerge until at least a couple of years after birth. An infant has no ideation of itself as an individual actor. You may then say, I was a male, female, human being, but this doesn't specify any particular human, you, yourself. We know that you are a male or a female human being, but those are general categories, and do not identify the particular individual that is, you. So, then, what exactly is it that remains, you, from conception until death? As demonstrated, it cannot be any particular thing, or object. That to which we refer as I, aham, in Sanskrit, is existence itself, which precedes any artificial sense of self, ahamkara, in Sanskrit. It is, in other words, no objective thing, non-localized spaciousness, the subject of all subjects, the ground of all being, which is the universal self. Therefore, your hypostatic nature is eternal being conscious bliss, usually referred to, quite inaccurately, as God, by theists. Of course, if one was to ask the typical theist of the nature of a person's essence, he or she would use the terms soul, or spirit, and indeed those terms are valid, assuming that one is not referring here to any localized, distinct being, or object. In this respect, see the entry, spirit, in the glossary. In order to answer the ultimate questions, who am I? And, what am I? I myself would respond, I am Jagadguru Swami Vegananda, who is, essentially, Brahman. So, whenever one is asked, who are you? It would be disingenuous, and downright pretentious and ostentatious, to claim to be God, Spirit, Brahman, etc. But in response to the question, what are you? These concepts are certainly reasonable and accurate. The hierarchy of subjectivity. Some chapters of this holy scripture teach that the sense of I am that precedes the false sense of self, which in turn is antecedent to the recognition of one's intellect, which in turn precedes one's mind, which in turn is antecedent to one's gross physical body, is the very ground of all being, Brahman, in Sanskrit. However, it should have been made very, very clear in each instance in which this was explained, that even though it is indeed accurate to state that the impersonal sense of I am is Brahman, so too is the pseudo-ego, the intellect, the mind, etc. This is blatantly obvious to anyone who understands what is Brahman. However, the sole reason for this teaching that, in order to discover the fundamental self, or the ground of all being, one need do nothing but inquire into his or her very own nature, is because we humans have been thoroughly conditioned over many years or decades, to believe that gross matter is the most fundamental reality. In fact, just as I was composing this very paragraph, I was listening to a question and answer video, by one of the most acclaimed physicists on Earth, in which he bluntly asserted that the very ground of existence is some particle of matter. That scientist, as well as most academics in his field, consider consciousness to be an epiphenomenon of gross matter, neural networks. This may be factually correct regarding the discrete consciousness of individual animals, but there also exists universal consciousness, i.e., pure being. Unfortunately, intelligence does not necessarily correlate with wisdom. Such a materialistic worldview implies that the qualia we experience is built upon an infinitesimally minute subatomic particle. How bizarre! Hence, the apophatic method of discovering ultimate reality is fundamentally flawed, since not but ultimate reality exists. Self-realization, waking up to the real self. So, when a neophyte begins his study of yoga religion, he or she is taught that the material world, including his/her own body, is not real, but the self-soul alone is real. Then, after a sufficient measure of realization and awakening has taken place, the student comes to understand that the things he/she previously believed to be unreal or illusory are, in fact, indifferentiated from that ultimate reality which he/she has realized. Both aspects of ultimate reality, that is, both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, i.e. mind and matter, are simply two sides of the very same coin, figuratively speaking. Consult chapters 05 and 06 for a fuller understanding of the notion of Brahman, ultimate reality. Consequently, whenever the word ego is heard in practically any spiritual, religious context, it is not to be taken literally, that is, as the self, or simply I, but in the sense of ahamkara, that is, the I maker, I doer, a mistaken sense of self-identity, or sometimes as a synonym for superciliousness, since each spiritual teacher has his or her own understanding, or misconception, of the notion of egoity. Inept Sanskrit to English translators are probably guilty for this misunderstanding. Unfortunately, this glaringly obvious mistake is very seldom mentioned in spiritual talks and writings, because the typical religious preceptor is not but a deluded buffoon, what to speak of their gullible sycophants. The false and true selves. Conventional, false, egoity is an errant conception of oneself, or, of oneself. In other words, it is the idea that, I am an independent agent, with the volition to freely think, feel, and behave as I choose, instead of simply an unqualified, I am, aham, in Sanskrit, or at the very least, I am all-encompassing existence, aham brahmasmi, in Sanskrit. Simply put, it is identification with anything not of the actual self. In practical terms, it is any noun or adjective placed after the expression, I am. For example, I am a woman, I am intelligent, or, I am old. So, when a human being misidentifies himself/herself with a particular body-mind holobiont, it is pseudo-ego, ahamkara, but when he or she identifies with absolute awareness Brahman, acting through the body-mind organism, it is the authentic ego, soham asmi, in Sanskrit. Additionally, the authentic self, Atman, in Sanskrit, is identical with the universal self, Paramatman, in Sanskrit. This identification with the universal self may occur during or following a peak experience of cosmic awakening, or it may ensue after a period of yogic practice, see chapter 16, for a description of the four systems of yoga religion. In my own particular case, following decades of earnest religious practice, I rarely lose sight of the realization that I am, essentially, the all. Yet, even this understanding and realization was destined from all eternity, see the next chapter, regarding free will. Obviously, this misidentification with one's mind and body, or in Vedic terms, name and form, nama rupa, in Sanskrit, is not a flaw of the flawless absolute, but merely a play, lila, in Sanskrit, of the divine comedy in which we find ourselves. In other words, we humans, and of course, all lower species of animalia, are intended to be radically deluded creatures, save for one or two genuinely enlightened sages, at any given time within our relatively brief evolutionary history, who have factually awakened to both ultimate reality, and to the most accurate possible understanding of life. Such enlightened masters are invariably found without traditional so-called religious, sects, cults, groups, as they have completely and utterly transcended any set of dogmatic, unverifiable body of doctrinal beliefs. The human being is a psychophysical complex which is none other than Brahman. Normally, we humans believe that we are a body-mind organism. Those who have awakened, or at least, who are spiritually aware, consider themselves to not be their body-mind, but a soul, or a spirit, or else consider themselves to be the all-Brahman, in Sanskrit. One who is truly enlightened, knows for certain that he is both a human being on the relative level, but quintessentially, the very ground of being, in the absolute sense. That which can perceive any impermanent phenomenon, including the I-maker, or the intellect, or the mind, is the real self. When properly analyzed, the phrase, I am spirit, or, I am all, aham brahmasmi, in Sanskrit means, I, the ego, i.e. the relative persona, am nothing, everything, Brahman, Tao, spirit, the absolute ground of being. Chapter 06 explores further the nature of this supreme self. In conclusion, one should use the correct terminology. Finally, it could be argued, with some degree of merit, that since the English language already has a word for oneself, the first-person singular pronoun, I, that we ought to keep using the English dictionary definitions of ego as the false sense of oneself, or at least, pride. However, because the great majority of supposedly advanced religionists and spiritual practitioners outside of India, who speak of these concepts, base their lexis on the Sanskrit and/or Pali texts of ancient Bharata, it is far more accurate to separate ego, aham, from egoity, or constructing one's identity, ahamkara. The literal translation should predominate, in order to avoid ambiguity, but I am quite certain that this will never eventuate, due to the pre-existing state of affairs, and because very few humans will carefully study this highly intellectual chapter of FISH. It may prove beneficial for the typical seeker to delay reading this particular chapter until one has repeatedly studied the remaining chapters. The main lesson here to be gained, for over 99% of readers, is that whenever the word ego is used, both within the so-called ultra-spiritual community, as well as in general English discourse, it is almost definitely being used incorrectly, and perhaps, it should be avoided altogether. Consciousness is never experienced in the plural, only in the singular. Even in the pathological cases of split consciousness or double personality, the two persons alternate, they are never manifest simultaneously. In a dream we do perform several characters at the same time, but not indiscriminately, we are one of them. In him we act and speak directly, while we often eagerly await the answer or response of another person, unaware of the fact that it is we who control his movements and his speech just as much as our own. Each of us has the indisputable impression that the sum total of his own experience and memory forms a unit, quite distinct from that of any other person. He refers to it as I. What is this I? If you analyze it closely, you will, I think, find that it is just a little bit more than a collection of single data, experiences and memories, namely the canvas upon which they are collected. And you will, on close introspection, find that what you really mean by I is that ground stuff upon which they are collected. From the epilogue to What is Life? Erwin Rudolf Joseph Alexander Schrödinger. Austrian physicist. The world is ego mummery. The world is mad. Humankind is in a constant state of extreme psychosis, don't you know? Therefore, knowing that, choose to take the cure. From The Gnostican, Part 7. Franklin Jones, aka Avatar Adi Da Samraj. American spiritual master.